With question 89 of the Summa Theologia, we come to a very interesting question. I remember the first time I came across this question, I found it absolutely fascinating because in this treatise on man, everything that St. Thomas Aquinas has been talking about with the soul so far has been the soul united to a body, the intellectual soul of a human person united to matter, united to the body, and the epistemology, the knowledge by which we know things, always is dependent upon the body. So now in question 89, there's going to be 8 articles talking about the knowledge of the separated soul. Okay, so now what happens when we die, and the very definition of death is the separation of soul and body. So now you have a corpse here below, and we believe that the soul, remember, is subsistent. We did talk about that many days ago. So it's subsistent, it can exist on its own, but how does it function and how can it know things? Because up until now, Thomas has been very, very intent and very dedicated to the idea that the soul needs the body, it needs the senses in order to come to know things. And by the way, I've cracked out my original Summa that I bought about 15 years ago. You can see that this thing is really well read, and I just poured through it a number of times and highlighted everything. And so because of a printing issue, I'm going to use this for the first article of this particular question, and then I'll go to my printout pages. So the first article in this question says whether the separated soul can understand anything. Okay, this is a very logical question that you might ask as you're going through the Summa, thinking, well, what happens? How can it know anything without the body? And St. Thomas Aquinas does a really great job in explaining this. He says, the philosopher says that if the soul had no proper operation, it could not be separated from the body, but the soul is separate from the body, therefore it has a proper operation. Okay, the above all and that which consists in intelligence. Okay, so he's quoting Aristotle here, saying the soul's, one of its primary faculties and purposes is intelligence, and so it does have that. But what about when it's separated from the soul? He says the difficulty in solving this question arises from the fact that the soul united to the body can understand only by turning to phantasms. Okay, he's talked about that many times, abstracting phantasms from physical material things, as experience shows. Did this not proceed from the soul's very nature, but accidentally, through its being bound up with the body, as the Platonists say, the difficulty would vanish. For in this case, when the body was removed, the soul would at once return to its nature and would understand intelligible things simply without turning to the phantasms, as is exemplified in the case of separate substances. And so here he's referring to Plato, who thought that the body was just something that the soul kind of lugged around, and as soon as we die, the soul is free from the body. But in Christian theology and philosophy, we don't believe that to be the case. We believe that the body has great dignity. The body is important. The soul needs the body, right? But he's saying, okay, so we're not Platonists in that regard. In this case, however, the union of soul and body would not be for the soul's good, for evidently it would understand worse in the body than out of it. So he's saying if once the soul separates and it has a much better capacity to understand things, well, then the body would be a hindrance to the soul, and that wouldn't seem to make sense, right? But for the good of the body, which would be unreasonable, since matter exists on the count of the form and not the form for the sake of the matter. But if we admit that the nature of the soul requires it to understand by turning to phantasms, it will seem, since death does not change its nature, that it can then naturally understand nothing, as the phantasms are wanting to which it may turn. So he's saying, okay, what's going on here? Once the soul leaves the body, how is it going to possibly know anything? And so he comes to the conclusion saying the soul has one mode of being when in the body, and another when apart from it, its nature remaining always the same, but this does not mean that its union with the body is an accidental thing. So he's saying, okay, there's two different modes here. It's the same thing. It hasn't changed significantly, but it has two modes of coming to knowledge, right? The soul, therefore, when united to the body, consistently with the mode of its existence, has a mode of understanding by turning to corporeal phantasms. All right, so you and I right now, the way we come to know things is first through the senses, informing the passive and active intellect, and that's how we come to understand things, right? Which are incorporeal organs. And when it is separated from the body, it has a mode of understanding by turning to simple, intelligible objects as is proper to other separate substances. Okay? He says at the end of this, it is clear then that it was for the soul's good that it was united to a body, and that it understands by turning to the phantasms. Nevertheless, it is possible for it to exist apart from the body and also to understand in another way. So Thomas is really kind of playing it both ways here, saying that yes, the body's necessary. Yes, it's natural for a soul to be united to a body. It's unnatural for it not to be. But at the same time, since the soul is subsistent and it does have intellect, subsistent and not dependent absolutely on the body, that when it is separated, it still has a mode of knowledge apart from the body, kind of like an angel, but we don't become angels, right? All right, Article 2, whether the separated soul understands separate substances. Now, by separate substances, we mean angels, God, that kind of thing. Okay, something that is not visible. And Thomas says, from the knowledge which the separated soul has of itself, we can judge how it knows other separate things, because the soul is, when it's separate, it is immaterial, just like an angel. Now, it was said above that as long as it is united to the body, the soul understands by turning to phantasms, and therefore it does not understand itself save through becoming actually intelligible by means of ideas abstracted from phantasms. When, however, it is separated from the body, it understands no longer by turning to phantasms, but by turning to simple, intelligible objects. So we can't do that here. We can't know angels. We can't know God in his essence here below. That's something that we need, divine assistance with. But the separated soul will be angelic in the sense, and it will be able to come to know these non-corporeal objects. Hence, in that state, it understands itself through itself. Now, every separate substance understands what is above itself and what is below itself according to the mode of its substance. And the mode of existence of a separated soul is inferior to that of an angel, but is the same as that of other separated soul. Therefore, the soul apart from the body has perfect knowledge of other separated souls, but has an imperfect and defective knowledge of the angels so far as it has natural knowledge, as far as natural knowledge is concerned. But the knowledge of glory is otherwise. So that means when it's separated and on its own power, it does have some kind of fuzzy knowledge of the angels. But when it's glorified, and that means it's received its, beatitude, then everything changes. And then God is able to infuse in us some perfect knowledge where we could be equal to the angels, as Thomas is going to be very adamant in saying. Article 3, whether the separated soul knows all natural things. And he says here, the separated soul, like the angels, understands by means of species received from the influence of the divine light. Okay, that has to do with infusion. Nevertheless, as the soul by nature is inferior to an angel, to whom this kind of knowledge is natural, the soul apart from the body, through such species, does not receive perfect knowledge, but only a general and confused kind of knowledge. Separated souls, therefore, have the same relation through such species to imperfect and confused knowledge of natural things as the angels have to the perfect knowledge thereof. So the knowledge infused in the angels is different because they don't have bodies. They don't come to know things through abstraction, because and therefore what God infuses in them is very good. It's perfect. But in us, naturally, when it's infused after the soul leaves the body, it's going to be in an imperfect state. Now, angels, through such species, know all natural things perfectly, because all that God has produced in the respective natures of natural things has been produced by him in the angelic intelligence. It follows that separated souls know all natural things, not with a certain and proper knowledge, but in a general and confused way. Article 4, whether the separated soul knows singulars. All right, there's like this one butterfly here. Okay, do we know singular things? Because remember, the intellect deals with universals. It's the senses that deal with individual things and not universals. Separated souls know some singulars, but not all, not even all present singulars. To understand this, we must consider that there is a twofold way of knowing things. One by means of abstraction from phantasms, and in this way, singulars cannot be directly known by the intellect, but only indirectly, as stated above. The other way of understanding is by the infusion of species by God, and in this way it is possible for the intellect to know singulars, for as God knows all things, universal and singular, by his essence, as the cause of universal and individual principles, so likewise separate substances, angels, can know singulars by species, which are a kind of participated similitude of the divine essence. Okay, so our intellect and the angels' intellects participate in the divine essence. Okay, we do not know everything through our essence, and neither do the angels, but through a participation. There is a difference, however, between the angels and separated souls in the fact that through these species, the angels have a perfect and proper knowledge of things, whereas separated souls only have a confused knowledge. So this confusion keeps coming back. Hence, the angels, by reason of their perfect intellect, through these species, know not only the specific natures of things, but also the singulars contained in those species. So remember, the angels can understand broad species. Like I used the example one time of knowing a house. And when you know the house, you know all the parts of the house. And that's how angels know it. They know these broad species, but then within the broad species, they know the specifics as well. Article 5, whether the habit of knowledge here acquired remains in the separated soul. All right, the habit of knowledge, what we've acquired here below, as far as the habit of being able to come to know things. Some say that the habit of knowledge resides not in the intellect itself, but in the sensitive powers, namely the imaginative, the cogitative, and the memorative. Remember these parts of the sensitive soul? And that the intelligible species are not kept in the passive intellect. If this were true, it would follow that when the body is destroyed by death, knowledge here acquired would also be entirely destroyed. So he's saying that if everything that we learned was in the sensitive part of our soul, which does not leave when the soul separates the body, it remains with the body, then everything would be lost. But he says, since knowledge resides in the intellect, which is the abode of species, the habit of knowledge here acquired must be partly in the aforesaid sensitive powers and partly in the intellect. This can be seen by considering the very actions from which knowledge arises. Now, the actions of the intellect by which knowledge is here acquired are performed by the mind turning to the phantasms in the aforesaid sensitive powers. Hence, through such acts, the passive intellect acquires a certain facility in considering the species received. So he's saying here that the passive intellect, the active intellect, work with the senses. Okay, it's kind of a tandem thing. And the aforesaid sensitive powers acquire a certain aptitude in seconding the action of the intellect when it turns to them to consider the intelligible object. But as the intellectual act resides chiefly and formally in the intellect itself, while it resides materially and dispositively in the inferior powers, the same distinction is to be applied to habit. Okay, this is the last sentence. Knowledge, therefore, acquired in the present life does not remain in the separated soul as regard what belongs to the sensitive powers, but as regards what belongs to the intellect itself, it must remain. So it sounds like he's saying that there is some of it that remains and some of it that doesn't. That's at least my take on this. Article 6, whether the act of knowledge acquired here remains in the separated soul. He says, the state of the separated soul is not the same as in this life, and therefore it follows that through the intelligible species acquired in this life, the soul apart from the body can understand what it understood formerly, but in a different way, not by turning to phantasms, but by a mode suited to a soul existing apart from the body. Thus, the act of knowledge here acquired remains in the separated soul, but in a different way. He's already kind of explained this. All right, local distance, does it impede the knowledge of the separated soul? Like right now, if I am to know something, it has to be in my view. If I'm going to come to know a particular dog or a particular sunrise, I need to see it. I need to have some kind of like proximity to it. But he says some have held that the separated soul knows the singular by abstraction from the sensible. If that were so, it might be that local distance would impede its knowledge, for either the sensible would need to act upon the soul or the soul upon the sensible, and in either case a determinate distance would be necessary. This is, however, impossible because abstraction of the species from the sensible is done through the senses and other sensible faculties which do not remain in the separated soul apart from the body. But the soul, when separated, understands singulars by species derived from the divine light. Okay, this is infusion, which is indifferent to what is near or distant. Okay, so the distance is not going to matter. All right, so finally, the soul separates, the corpse remains, but life goes on here below. And so he's saying, does the separated soul know what's going on, here below? And this will be the last article. He says, by natural knowledge of which we are treating now, the soul of the dead does not know what passes on earth. Separated souls have knowledge of singulars by being in a way determined to them, either by some vestige of previous knowledge or affection or by the divine order. Okay, this is what happened previously. Now, the souls departed are in a state of separation from the living, both by divine order and by their mode of existence, whilst they are joined to the world and incorporeal spiritual substances, and hence they are ignorant of what goes on. Now, Augustine has a very interesting take on this. He is quoted as saying, the souls of the dead have no concern in the affairs of the living. His reason for this is fascinating. Thomas also, and I'll get back to Augustine in a second, Thomas also quotes Gregory as saying, the case of the holy souls is different, for since they see the light of Almighty God, we cannot believe that external things are unknown to them. So Gregory is saying that in heaven, the separated soul would know what's happening here on earth. But Augustine says, the dead, even the saints, do not know what is done by the living or by their own children. Now get this. He says he confirms this opinion by saying that he was not visited nor consoled in sorrow by his mother, Saint Monica, as when she was alive, and he could not think it possible that she was less kind when in a happier state. So he didn't get any consolation from Monica after she died, and therefore he came to the conclusion through personal experience that the dead are not going to be able to know what's going on with the living. Yet Augustine says, he says, let everyone take as he pleases what I say. Gregory, on the other hand, is positive, since he says we cannot believe. His opinion, indeed, seems to be the more probable one, that the souls of the blessed who see God do know all that passes here. Okay, this is now Thomas's opinion. For they are equal to the angels, of whom Augustine says that they know what happens among those living on earth, but as the souls of the blessed are most perfectly united to the divine justice, they do not suffer from sorrow, nor do they interfere in mundane affairs except in accordance with divine justice. So Aquinas finally comes to the conclusion that yes, if God so wills it, only through God's allowance, the souls separated from their bodies in the state of beatitude, the blessed, will be able to know what's going on here, but only according to divine justice, and they won't be caught up in mundane affairs or getting sad about things that are happening here below, because of course in a state of beatitude you're not going to have any sadness at all. All right, that was kind of a long one, I know, but hopefully you enjoyed that. It all has to do with how much knowledge does a separated soul have after it leaves the body at death. Thanks for joining with me through the Summa. This is question number 89. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.